So I'm going to talk today about floating wind. For those of you who haven't really done digging into floating wind, I hope you come out of this presentation understanding what a floating wind turbine looks like, how it works, what we're doing in Maine about it, what's going on around the world about it. So these are the three things I'll talk about. This is one example of a floating turbine. Basically think of it as a ship holding up a turbine. It floats over the water. The ship is moored to the seabed with mooring lines and anchors and holds up the turbine. Now, to give you a sense of scale, this is a floating turbine. And if you see where my cursor is, can you all see my cursor? Yeah. And there's a school bus there. Okay. That gives you a sense of scale what these turbines looks like. So this is not a tiny thing. They're large. The biggest turbines available in the world today that are operating are 16 megawatts, and each blade is 1 1/3 football field long. So 2 blades, a rotor would be more than 2.5 football fields in diameter. So this is a very, very big unit we're talking about. Now notice that it floats over the water. What makes it float? I'll talk about that in just a minute. So I'll tell you about who we are, why floating wind, how do you engineer a floating wind turbine, why does it float, how does it float, what we've done in Maine with floating wind, and what are the opportunities and challenges that we see with floating wind. The good news is 15 years ago, people thought, many of us researchers who worked on floating wind were not completely with it. A year ago, or this last year, the federal government declared floating wind as the next US Earthshot, meaning it's a key technology to meet as well as our energy goals. The federal government's goal is to reach 15 gigawatts of floating wind by 2035 in the US and reduce the cost of floating wind by 70%. This is our research center at the University of Maine. We're the largest university-based research center in Maine. We have, and to give you a sense of facilities we have in there to move offshore wind forward, this is an example of a wind blade test facility that we have, that's how we test wind blades to make sure they'll hold up 20 and 30 years offshore. And notice the blade is long enough that it could almost hit the ceiling in this particular facility, but you can run that for about 2 months and replicate 20 to 30 years of life. This is a wind wave basin facility that we built to test floating turbines at scale, essentially shrink the turbine size and use the laws of physics to replicate what the motions offshore. So we apply wind loads and wave loads in this facility together, create storms, and figure out how these wind turbines behave under 50 and 500 year storms and so on. And to show you what that actually looks like, this is how we create waves in a wave wind basin facility. And you could see the wind being created out there. And you'll see in just a minute a wind turbine being subjected to a 50-year storm in this particular case. And this is scaled at 150 scale of a full-size unit, but that gives us enough data to prove that it works in the long run. What's the potential for floating wind in the US? Why do we need floating wind? When the water depth is more than about 300 feet, it becomes too costly to fix the turbine to the seabed, so you'd have to float it. If you look at around the United States, the areas in dark blue are deep waters that require floating wind. And you could see in California, it's all dark blue. So you really the only option you got floating wind. On the East Coast, there are some areas in light blue where you can use fixed bottom turbines. But the Gulf of Maine where we live is all dark blue, as you see here. So Maine and California share something very much in common. We have deep waters and we have to use floating wind. And now on the East Coast, there's a lot of shallow water areas, and there's a lot of projects right now on the East Coast to use fixed bottom turbines nearer to the shore off the coast of New England, as well as the mid-Atlantic states. And the goal in the US is to put 30 gigawatts of fixed bottom wind on the East Coast by 2030. And that would be about $100 billion investment and will create an estimated 44,000 jobs. But let's go back to floating wind. how many floating wind projects are there around the world? As of June of this year, there was roughly about 121 gigawatts of floating wind projects in different forms of development. Nothing built yet. There's only a few demonstration projects out there, but that's a lot. 121 gigawatts. That's roughly $500 billion investment. And there are only a few floating projects around the world right now. Some exist and some are planned. These are typically smaller projects, usually a single turbine or up to 5 or to 6 or 7 turbines. And you can see where they are around the world, where some are planned. One of them is off the coast of Maine. We call it the Maine Research Array. What do floating turbines look like? There's over 100 different designs of floating turbines today, but they're inspired from oil and gas rigs that float in the ocean. So essentially, the engineers have taken oil and gas rigs and modified the design so you can hold up a wind turbine on them. These are floating oil and gas rigs. And you can see how many different designs are out there. The one that was developed in Maine is in the center there. It's made out of concrete, and you can fabricate it locally. These are, but there are, even though there's a lot of different designs, there are only 4 families of designs of floating wind. The one that we're using in Maine is called the semi-submersible. It's in the center. It's this one right here. Can you see my cursor at all?
I saw it a second ago. Yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yes, so this here is a what we call a semi-submersible. What it has 3 flotation columns that have air in them, and that what holds up the turbine, and then it's moored to the seabed with mooring lines and anchors. Now, this design is called the spar design. It's like a big floating tube. It's got a mast at the very bottom of the tube that keeps it right up, but the tube's full of air with a mast at the bottom that makes it stay right up. It's as if you took a can of Pepsi and put some sand at the bottom and have it full of air, and you put it in the water, it'll stand up. And that's what a spar design looks like, but it's still to the seabed. There's another design called the tension leg platform that has essentially a submerged
the sound
vessel.
cut out for me real quick. Was that me or was that everybody?
Place.
And that wants to pop out of the water, but you have tension legs that keeps it connected to the seabed. And but there are challenges in California for floating wind. The good news is you had a very successful bone lease auction here not too long ago, so that's a great step forward. But California has very deep waters compared to Maine and other places, 1,000 meters or more, 3,000 feet. That adds costs. And there's been no demonstration project in the world that had deep waters like this yet. So we've got to contend with deep waters in California and developing mooring lines and systems that will work in these different environments. Typically, a mooring line has a mooring anchor at the end of it. There's different types of anchors you could use depending on what kind of soils you have. The most common one used is called the drag anchor. It looks like a plow that you drag onto the seabed, and it embeds itself into the seabed. And the shape of the plow allows it to dig into the water. But there's other designs out there. You can use dead weights, you can use driven piles, you can use suction piles, and so on. You also have earthquakes to contend with in California. And we all have issues in the US that we don't have port facilities specifically designed for floating wind. And California, I know, is looking at different port facilities, so is Maine, to allow us to move this industry forward. The other big issue is the supply chain. If California wants 45 or 35 gigawatts by 2045 of floating wind, we're going to have to develop a local supply chain for that, and that's not simple. That needs to be done in time to get to these projects that we need to build on time. You also have deep water, so substations offshore need to float or need to be put at the seabed, and that's also a technology that's still under development. Now, the other thing that's going on is turbines are getting bigger and bigger. The biggest turbine available today are 16 megawatts that's operating today, but the designs are growing to 20 and to 25 megawatts right now. And what that means is you have to lift bigger turbines and you have to handle bigger turbines at port facilities. And so that creates a lot of issues as you design a port facility, so it's not obsolete as you build it. Going back to Maine a little bit, the reason we got into offshore wind close to 15 years ago is fossil fuel prices went up to $4 a gallon close to 15 years ago. We were in a crisis mode in Maine because we heat with oil. And so what we started looking at is using offshore wind, floating wind, to help heat homes in Maine using heat pumps and fill up cars, if you wish. So we put a plan together, and in 2013 we deployed the first offshore wind turbine in the United States. It was designed and built by our lab. And then next year, we're going to put another turbine in the water using a new design. And in 26, we'll put yet another single turbine in the water. And in 2030, 31, we're going to put an array that has 10 turbines. And then beyond 2030, we hope we're going to have commercial farms in the mid 2030s. We call our plan 110, 100. In other words, we're going to start with single turbine, then go put 10 in the water, then put 100 out there. So it's crawl before you walk, walk before you run, so we can develop an equitable industry that doesn't damage the environment and that doesn't damage the fisheries in the state and takes care of native communities' concerns and so forth. So that's the way we're proceeding in Maine with a 110-100 plan. I'll show you the first unit we deployed 10 years ago, last month. That's a 1:8 scale version of a full-size unit. And you could see, even though it's 1:8 scale, it's not tiny. You could see the people under that. We built it at the university and then in pieces and assembled that in Brewer, Maine, and then towed it down the Penobscot River in Maine, as you see right here. And we moored it off Castine, Maine. This is a lighthouse, beautiful spot in Maine. If you've never been to Maine, Castine is a place you want to visit. And we had an undersea cable that connects the unit to shore. And this is what it looked like in the very first major storm. This is called Winter Storm Electra. It was on December 15th, 2013. And what you see blown across is snow. Okay, this is not wind or cloud, that's snow. And it was a 50-year return period storm relative to the size of the hull. And you could see the white caps on the size of the hull. So in the real world, a 50-year wave in the Gulf of Maine is 60 feet from peak to trough. So this thing is being subjected to equivalent 60-foot waves, and you don't see it move. So it does work. So we can survive 50-year storms with floating turbines and 500-year storms. We know how to do that today. We weren't sure 15 years ago and 10 years ago, but we know how to do this today. And so what we're up to right now is building 2 single turbine projects, and that's what our turbine looks like, or the hull looks like. It's made out of concrete. We call it Volturnus. The reason we chose concrete is because we can make it locally and keep the jobs local, and because it lasts longer in the corrosive environment. So we hope in California you'll be looking at similar technologies as well, so you can keep the jobs local for the hulls. How do you connect the cable to shore? Typically, each turbine would have a cable that comes down from the turbine, down the tower, down the side of the hull, and then down to the seabed. And it makes what we call a lazy S-curve. And the lazy S-curve has buoyancy modules on the electric cable so that it will follow the turbine as the turbine moves around, because the turbine is more to the seabed like a ship is. When the wind and waves come from different directions, the turbine will move around to go downwind and downwave. And therefore the electrical cable has to follow it. So we call that the dynamic cable. So we have a piece of the cable that makes this lazy S-curve. It's then fixed to the seabed and it continues on beyond that. In California, those water depths are 3,000 feet that you have to deal with. So this is not a simple dynamic cable to deal with. What does a cable look like? You can use a cable or you could use a chain. And to give you a sense of scale for what we're doing in Maine, that's a 6-foot human being. That's the size of one link in the chain, okay? And that's the size of a synthetic mooring line that could be used instead of a steel chain line. We're focused on synthetic mooring lines in Maine because they have a smaller footprint. But notice when people say, what's it going to do to the whales? The answer is it won't, because the whales will not get entangled in anything this big. And this is like a telephone pole. The whale won't get wrapped around it. So people ask that question a lot. Typically, what you want to do is bury the cable under the water, so in the mud, and if you can, and you do cable surveys and get around rock outcrops, so you can bury the cable 6 feet or more if you can. Typically, one advantage of floating wind turbines is people don't necessarily have to look at them because you can put them far enough from shore that you don't see them from land. And that's one advantage of floating wind, that you don't have the visual effect. Our main research array that we plan to build will have 10 to 12 turbines, 15 megawatt each, and that will be constructed in 2030-31. Why 2030-31 is because we need to build a port first to build this. And it takes a few years to build a port, as you know. And that's why it's going to be 2030-31. Otherwise, we're ready to go faster, but without a port, we can't build it. And so there's a big need for floating ports. We've been designing different ports in Maine and to try to build one. And they're not cheap. You're looking at a minimum of $250 to $500 million to build a port. It could be quite a bit more than that as well. And the bigger the port is, of course, the faster you can assemble and build turbine and deploy them. And I know in Humboldt Bay, and our colleagues there are studying that very, very, very effectively, as well as, of course, in the Port of LA. So in terms of summary here, what are the opportunities and challenges for floating wind? Well, the good news is floating wind right now is mainstream. It's a US shot. And California can do 25 gigawatts by 2045, but that requires significant planning. The Inflation Reduction Act is a plus. What are the big issues with California? You have very deep waters, so that adds cost and adds risk for these designs. You have earthquakes to contend with that could liquefy the soils and undermine the foundations. The question is, if you're going to get 25 gigawatts, how would you develop a local supply chain to maximize the local jobs and train people on time to do all of this? You also need port facilities, just like we do in Maine and other parts of the world. And that's a key. I tell everybody, we need a Marshall Plan for ports in the United States for this to work. So in terms of an advocate group, Megan, is focusing on really developing a Marshall Plan for US ports to make this vision a reality is key for us. We don't have enough funding at the federal level to build the ports that we need to build. And that's a big challenge to get us there. We need to also plan for recycling these units after they're done. What do we do with them? That's really important. We can't just let the next generation worry about them. And then we need to also figure out how to speed permitting, but at the same time, truly protect the environment, the local stakeholders, the fisheries, and indigenous communities that are key to all of this. So it was really a great pleasure to have an opportunity to talk to you. And I wish you all the luck in California and look forward to opportunities to collaborate.